Ladies and gentlemen, thank you all very much for coming along. I'm delighted to introduce Professor Lloyd Bowen from Cardiff University. Lloyd is becoming a sort of one-man publishing industry because he's been so prolific over the last few years. A fabulous book on John Lampeter, followed by a recent book on Edward Vaughan, a stunning early modern Wales, which can only be commended to everybody with interest in early modern Wales. And in addition, a slew of articles which are really changing the face of our knowledge of early modern Wales. And today, continuing in that trend, he's talking about the London Puritan networks and the publication of the 1630 Welsh Bible. Lloyd.
Thank you. And thank you ever so much for the invitation to come here and for getting out some of your wonderful tracts for me to take a look at before the talk. So yes, this is my talk this evening on London Puritan networks and this 1630 Bible. And the translation of the Bible into Welsh is, of course, a critical, but perhaps not wholly unproblematic reference point in our historiography of what happens in Wales in the 16th and 17th century. What we might describe as the vernacularization of scripture, the putting of scripture into the Welsh language, dominates the country's Reformation history. We have a kind of narrative of powerful individuals resisting Anglicizing forces and saving the Welsh language through the publication of these sorts of texts. The emphasis then moves, if you like, to the more radical nonconformists of the mid-17th century. The baton, if you like, is passed to them, people like William Roth, Walter Erbry, and Vavasor Powell. So this evening, I'd like to connect these trends of vernacularizing the Bible and emerging Welsh Puritanism through a discussion of the publication in 1630 of a portable Welsh Bible, a Bible Bach, a small Bible. Now, until this point, the Welsh Bible had been, well, like that, a prestige folio edition, which was intended for use in churches only. That meant that the Bible was really only accessible through the church. It wasn't there for individual scriptural study, and I think that helped militate against developing Puritanism. But the production of an affordable Welsh Bible in 1630 is seen as very important for nurturing what we might describe as Puritan impulses in the Principality, although we know very little about the text's origins, its production history, or its distribution. What I'm going to do this evening, I hope, is bring some new evidence to bear on this text's publication, and in the process, I'm going to try and reveal the Puritan network behind its production and its troubled distribution. The evidence centers around a lawsuit in the Court of Chancery, initiated in 1634 between the widows of the volume's two principal sponsors. And this suit in Chancery reveals in unusual detail the financial backing and the distribution network of the Bible, and it uncovers some fascinating new aspects, I think, of the personalities and places involved in that effort. So we get a really unusual insight into vernacular publishing, particularly Welsh publishing, the distribution network behind it, and the way in which metropolitan godly elites looked to reform Wales through these kinds of initiatives. I'm also going to argue that this Bible is actually only one part of a concerted Welsh language publication effort, and we haven't really understood the connections between this and the Bible between 1629 and 1632, which was sponsored and encouraged by the circle that produced this Bible. The new evidence also suggests some of the reasons why this portable Bible actually fails in its efforts to address the spiritual needs of the Welsh-speaking population, and why only a few years later Puritans would continue to say they don't have enough of these texts in their households. We need to begin, however, with the two principal sponsors of the 1630 volume, whose names appear in the Bible's preface and who have been known to us, therefore, for centuries. Although it must be said that historians haven't done much with these names. So they are Rowland Heylyn and Sir Thomas Middleton. Here we have a rather poor reproduction of a portrait of Rowland Heylin. Heylin is a Shrewsbury native, born around about 1558. He attends Shrewsbury School, an emerging centre for religious reform, and probably part of that town's more advanced Puritan and Protestant community. He leaves Shrewsbury in 1576 to join the Ironmongers Company in London, where he rises through the ranks and becomes a master of that company by 1614. But he's also an influential metropolitan figure. He becomes an alderman and later London's sheriff. He's also a Puritan philanthropist, and he uses his wealth and his influence to sponsor godly reform in London, but also, importantly, in Wales and the Marches too. He endows a public lectureship, for example, in his native parish of St Alkmund's in Shrewsbury, and appoints the nonconformist Presbyterian minister, Julian Herring there, who was a committed Presbyterian and leader of the godly cause. He's also connected, Herring that is, with Richard Hunt and John Nichols. These are Heylin's brothers-in-law, and they are important individuals in the Puritan network here. And Hunt in particular is going to feature again in this talk. From 1625, Heylin is involved in a national scheme of Puritan sponsorship of godly preachers and ministers through a body which is known as the Fiefs for Impropriations. He's a leading member of that. This is a godly syndicate of London merchants and citizens who buy up the rights to livings, but then use considerable parts of those monies to support Puritan lectureships and ministers. And tellingly, they actually direct some of that effort towards Wales. This is a trait then of sponsorship that Heylin shares with his co-financier of the 1630 Bible, Sir Thomas Middleton. Middleton is a Denbigh man from North Wales. He was born there in the mid-1550s. And like Heylin, he enters the London livery scene. He becomes a grocer in the late 1570s and a substantial investor in a diverse portfolio of different mercantile enterprises. He becomes one of the founders of the East India Company, and he rather unexpectedly inherits the family's estate in North Wales. And by his death in 1631, he is said to be worth a staggering £8,000 a year. That's a lot of money in 1631. Now, to an even greater degree than Heylin, Middleton becomes an influential London politician, an alderman, a sheriff, and indeed Lord Mayor. And here he is in his mayoral garb in 1613. He becomes one of London's MPs in 1620. He shares with Heylin the traits of godliness and advanced Puritanism. He is part of a Puritan elite in London, fortified by ties of marriage and of civic interests. Importantly, he has connections with the Fiefs for Impropriations as well. And in addition to moving in godly circles and supporting nonconformist ministers, one aspect of his piety is important for our purposes this evening, that he wants to advance Protestantism in his native Wales, partly through sponsoring the production of religious texts in Welsh, an interest which will culminate in the production of the 1630 Bible. This text, for example, is the £20 which he gave in 1602. This is among his accounts, which appear in the National Library of Wales, to back a metrical version of the Psalms in Welsh, which were published by his cousin. So given the background and interests of these two figures, then, we, I think, can begin to understand the motivations for producing the Welsh Bible in the 1630, an effort to sponsor individual scriptural study, to boost the fortunes of reformed religion and in Wales and the Marches, and to support Welsh-speaking communities there. The royal printer's monopoly on Bible publication means that any text has to be produced in London, and the 1630 volume is indeed published by the King's printers, Robert Barker and his partner John Bill. Bill is in fact a Shropshire man as well. This is an image from the Sotheby's sale catalogue of Middleton's own copy of the Bible, which was sold in 2004. There's no marginalia as far as we can tell, but I am trying to run to ground Heylyn's copy, which I believe might well be in Shrewsbury School amongst the bequests that he made there. Now, the production of a Welsh text like this in London is going to be laborious and time-consuming. It's going to be costly. It requires a native speaker to help set up the type, to labour over the proofs. Now, we know that Michael Roberts, who becomes Principal of Jesus College, Oxford during the Republic of the 1650s, is one individual appointed by Archbishop Abbott to oversee this process. I think that he was assisted by a minister from the Shropshire area, a man called Oliver Thomas. We will hear a lot more about Oliver Thomas in a second. Now, historians have recognised this publication to be an important potential bridgehead for Puritanism, but given the absence around its production, its reception, they've been uncertain about the nature of its print run and its cost. But the Chancery case reveals not only that Heylyn and Middleton were not the only sponsors of this project, but rather that they were part of a consortium. And this consortium stumps up £450, again, a considerable amount, to print an impressive 3,000 of these volumes. But the very existence of a Chancery case itself indicates, as Dickens will tell you, not everything has gone to plan, and it is to this Chancery suit that I'm now going to turn. So on the 1st of April, 1634, Dame Anne Middleton, the widow and, importantly, the executor of Sir Thomas Middleton, who had died in August 1631, we know that Heylyn was actually present at his funeral in Essex, initiated a suit in Chancery against Alice Heylyn, the widow and again executor of Roland Heylyn, who had himself died in February 1632. Dame Anne said she was seeking to recover monies which she said were due to her husband's estate from the sale of these Welsh Bibles. She recorded that in January 1630, Middleton had come to an agreement with the King's printers to produce an octavo Bible in the Welsh tongue with the Psalms and the meter and liturgy included, and to advance so good a work, she said, Middleton had provided £175 with the hope of receiving his money back from sales. Dame Anne maintained that he committed the oversight of the printing and the volume, as well as the venting and uttering, the sale of those volumes, to Roland Heylyn. She continued that Heylyn had made a verbal agreement with Sir Thomas that he would be repaid his investment from sales. Because it's a verbal agreement, that's why it's in Chancery. Okay, it's because there's no documentation, so we go to an equity court to try and find it. The printers duly produced the Bibles by November 1630. These are delivered to Roland Heylyn, who we are told contracted with several chapmen for the sale of them unbound in quires. These chapmen, Dame Anne claimed, sold them at several rates and prices. But that despite this alleged verbal understanding between the two men, Sir Thomas had never received any money. So widow Middleton wanted to receive her proportionable profits, but also to obtain a census of how many Bibles had been sold and to whom, and to have an inventory of the great number of Bibles which remained in Alice Heylyn's hand. So this bill is interesting in and of itself and throws up a couple of noteworthy points. Firstly, it's often been assumed that the Welsh-speaking Middleton, rather than Heylyn, is the dominant figure in the project, but even this bill makes it clear that while Middleton may have opened negotiations, it was Heylyn who oversees the project, with Middleton acting as the largest but still minority investor. It's also noticeable, I think, that Heylyn is principally responsible for sales of the Bible. And we should note the scale of the undertaking, which is considerably in advance of most historians' estimates. Most historians think there's been about 1,000 to 1,500. But here we have 3,000 Bibles being produced. Although something of a drop in the ocean of the Welsh Protestant public, this could nonetheless put a Bible certainly into every congregation in the land, and it is of course much cheaper than the 1620 folio translation upon which it is based. It is essentially a reduced version of that Bible with the liturgy and the meter and the liturgy and the Psalms in it at the back. Now, Dame Anne Middleton had demanded something of an accounting. And mercifully, for historians like me, that is precisely what Alice Hayling gives in her answer to this bill on the 10th of May, 1634. She maintains that she's ignorant of the details of any agreement between their husbands about sales from Bibles, but she indicates that Hayling actually agrees with three others to raise £225, that is half of the principal cost. In fact, the chronology of Alice's answer suggests that Middleton was only brought in afterwards to become an investor in the consortium, and he agreed amongst themselves to cover the whole of the cost, with Middleton providing half of the monies. Now, the members of this investment group constitute the godly and esteemed citizens and merchants of London, who are referred to in the Bible's introductory epistle, but they've never previously been known. Alice's answer reveals that they were Richard Davis of Soper Lane, Richard Davis of Mincing Lane, welcome to Welsh history, they have the same name, and Matthew Craddock, who was a member of the Skinners Company. Now, we're going to return to these figures in a moment. In the end, we are told Sir Thomas Middleton only provided £175 of his promised 225, so Rowland stumps up the outstanding £50, bringing his own investment up to £106. The other three citizens contribute some £56 apiece. We are told that the printers come up about 156 texts short, so 2,884 Bibles are delivered to Rowland Hayling in November 1630. And then she provides some fascinating details on the distribution of that stock. I'm going to discuss that in a later part of the paper. Alice Hayling also maintained that, contrary to Dame Anne's version of events, the other four investors had agreed, in fact, that in underwriting the costs of the publication, they would, and I quote, not have made any profit thereby, but intending only piety therein, would have employed any profit and gain that they should have come thereby to other pious uses. So Dame Anne's version of the undertaking then is that this isn't, as she suggests, an opportunity for investment. Rather, it's simply a means for sponsoring provincial reform. So who are these individuals? Well, all are London merchants and all have roots reaching back into Wales or the Marches. The most high profile of them is a man called Matthew Craddock. Craddock is from Staffordshire, but he was born in Hasgard in Pembrokeshire. His father was rector there. He has roots going back into the Glamorgan gentry who had sired the Earls of Pembroke. He was apprenticed to a man called William Cockayne of the Skinners Company in 1606. By the early 1620s, he's a prominent investor in a number of colonial enterprises, including the East India Company, where, as we know, Middleton was a principal investor. He's also a founder of the Massachusetts Bay Company. In the late 1620s, he's appointed its first governor for a few short months before he's replaced by the famous John Winthrop. The company, of course, is a hotbed of Puritan activism. Many of its members also have very close links with the Fifis for Impropriations and Rowland Hayling. Craddock, we know, is friendly with the preacher for the Fifis for Impropriations, a man called John Davenport. And interestingly, with respect to our subject this evening, in the 1630s, the Massachusetts Bay Company was involved in the composition and translation of godly literature, what they described as seasonable treaties, for the use of those who lacked ready access to it, often in the New World, but I wonder whether exclusively in the New World. In a letter of February 1629, Craddock writes of the company's main end to bring the Indians to the knowledge of the gospel. And we might actually acknowledge at this point that in the 1620s and 1630s, the kind of ignorant Indians and the ignorant Welsh is a parallel that's made more than once in the literature of this period. So we shouldn't be surprised to see Craddock amongst this group then. He's of a Welsh background, from the London Livery Companies and its associated merchant networks, trying to sponsor godly causes and colonial enterprises, connected to Davenport, to the Fifis project, but also, interestingly, to Shrewsbury. His wife is Damaris, the daughter of a man called Richard Wynne of Shrewsbury. And Wynne, surprise, surprise, well, he's a Puritan. so bequeathing £300 in his will to maintain a public preacher in Shrewsbury, also giving money to Julian's Herring, that Presbyterian preacher who'd been put into St Alkmund's by Heylin. Now, the two other investors who share the name Richard Davis are more difficult to identify, but we can begin to distinguish them mercifully. Richard Davis of Soper Lane, which you might be able to see is kind of there. This is the Agas map of London. In Cheap Ward, he's the son of a Denbighshire gentleman, a man called John Davis of Earlisham, and of his wife Elizabeth Royden, who comes from Holt. This Richard Davis becomes a vintner, and he settles in London in the early 1620s. He is involved in Puritan philanthropic enterprises as well. He's also a member of the East India and Levant companies. He's an early undertaker in the Massachusetts Bay Company. He is also clearly a godly citizen. He's one of the citizen trustees on the board of the Fifis for Impropriations. At the baptism of his daughter Elizabeth in March 1632, he records that Mr. Davenport preaches at her baptism, the leading clerical light of the Fifis project. In his will, 1653, he also reveals that he knows Calvin Bruin, who is the son of the Cheshire iconoclast John Bruin. And Bruin is at the centre of Cheshire's sort of more radical wing at this time. We know as well that Bruin has a shop in Chester that sells godly literature, such as Alexander Leighton's controversial text, Sion's Plea Against the Prelacy. We also know that when the controversial Puritan William Prynne is on his way to jail in Carnarvon in 1637, he stops off at Chester and he buys a 1630 Welsh Bible from Calvin Bruin. Now, the other individual named Richard Davis is the most obscure member of the syndicate. He lives on Mincing Lane in Tower Street Ward. Here is the Tower of London. Here is Tower Street. Sir Thomas Middleton lives on Tower Street. So he's literally neighbours with Middleton. He's the youngest son of a man called John Davis from Middleton in Oswestry in Shropshire, a family whose paternal ancestors are located thoroughly in a Welsh milieu of the border counties. His maternal line runs through the Roydens of Holt. In other words, he's connected to his namesake amongst the godly sponsors. It seems that they're probably cousins. So these individuals then present us with a really interesting conjunction of London mercantile wealth, colonial interests, particularly in New England, advanced Protestant ties, and close connections with Wales and the border counties. Moreover, I would suggest that this is a more thoroughgoingly Puritan, indeed Presbyterian set of connections than is usually associated with the 1630 translation of the Bible. It's often seen as a quite ecumenical undertaking. But here we've got a knot of merchants closely tied in with the London's godly community, producing a text which is considered essential not only for raising sort of basic levels of understanding, but for advancing Puritan interests. Now, to return to Alice's 1634 answer, she enumerates that this consortium of godly Londoners produces nearly 3,000 Welsh Bibles and that these are all delivered to her husband. But she then enumerates to whom he gave those texts. Richard Davis of Mincing Lane and Matthew Craddock each received a proportionable part, so presumably around about 360 Bibles. Around about December 1631, Heylin delivers 508 bound Bibles to Richard Hunt of Shrewsbury, who in turn sends 104 to Mr. Dryhurst of Denbigh, a mercer. 50 more go to Oliver Thomas, a minister. After perusing her husband's correspondence, she said that she found Mr. Williams of the King's Wine Cellar had 100 Bibles. 50 more bound Bibles were sent to Bristol, to one Roger Royden, a bookseller, whereas they hath heard all unless 5 or 6 lie unsold. In addition, Rowland Heylin had 11 Bibles fair bound, which were given to some persons of great worth, by whose favour and means the said work might be more possible. We never find out who these people are. Since Heylyn's death in 1632, she said, I have heard from the stationer Philemon Stevens, a publisher and bookseller particularly associated with Calvinist clergymen, whose shop is a meeting place for Puritans, that he has 25 unbound text inquiries in his shop. She then proceeds to enumerate a few receipts that she's had for the sale of these works, pretty meagre figures in fact, apart from around about £12 from Richard Hunt, which represents the sales of perhaps 50 Bibles in that area. She then takes up the story from Heylyn's death down to her taking over as his executor. She said that she receives 1,800 Bibles, only 25 of which are bound, the rest in quires. So around about 1,060 of the original print run has been somehow distributed or sold. She then proceeds to deliver 375, mostly unbound, to Matthew Craddock, 175 to Richard Davis of Mincing Lane, and she says that there remains 1,257 Bibles on her hands, which she says, with 156 missing texts, would come up to around about Middleton's share of the inventory. She then goes on to say, oh, if Dame Anne will give her the £50 which her husband loaned of Sir Thomas's original agreed amount, then she's willing to hand over a large amount of unbound quires in Bibles. You know, who wants those, right? By way of equity. She also says that Heylyn had spent around about £40 on binding, carriage boxes, and delivery for these Bibles. So we've got a really interesting snapshot of the production and distribution mechanics of this Bible. The undertakers of the project, especially Matthew Craddock and Richard Davis of Mincing Lane, have got large numbers of Bibles, 700 plus. Although Craddock is prominent in the Massachusetts Bay Company, it's unlikely that he's going to distribute those works simply in Wales. It seems unlikely he's got those contacts to sell them there. Maybe he was willing to distribute them gratis to underwrite the costs himself. We've got around 200 Welsh Bibles going to the King's wine cellar, to a Mr. Williams. I'm not sure who that individual is, unfortunately. But we can run to ground some other individuals in this distribution network, and they constitute, I would argue, a really revealing and informative group themselves. So firstly, we've got Richard Hunt, who's taking delivery of over 500 Bibles. This is Roland Heylyn's brother-in-law. He lives in Shrewsbury, and Hunt, along with another townsman who marries one of Heylyn's sisters, Thomas Nichols, operates as Heylyn's men of business and principal contacts in this part of the world. In his 1632 will, indeed, Heylyn notes that Richard Hunt had for 20 years been my general bailiff and had been receiving rents on his properties. I don't think it's coincidental that when his first son is born in October 1607, Richard Hunt christens him Roland. He's a prominent member of the Shrewsbury Drapers Company, which had a reputation for supporting godly causes in the town. The Drapers actually support Julian's Herring, for example, and lease him their hall. When the borough is looking round for a new preacher in 1618, it sends Richard Hunt to the fountainhead of early Stuart Puritanism, a man called Lawrence Chatterton at Emmanuel College, Cambridge, to recommend a recipient for them. The fees for impropriations at Heylyn's urging buys up the tithes of St. Alkmund's, and Hunt is named as the tenant. The disgruntled incumbent of the living, a man called Thomas Lloyd, characterizes Hunt in 1634 simply as a Puritan, who pays his annuity of £50 to two Puritan preachers, nonconformists that live remote from this parish. Now, importantly, Hunt, as a draper, would have known woolen producers in Wales and the Marches, and the company's established trading routes provided him, I think, with a ready-made network for the onward distribution of the Bible into Welsh-speaking areas, especially in North Wales. We see these kind of processes, I think, in our knowledge that Hunt passes on 108 Bibles to a mercer of Denbigh, a Mr. Dryhurst. This is Richard Dryhurst, a notable figure in the small community of Denbigh. We don't know a lot about him, but we can connect him up readily to Sir Thomas Middleton, whose mother was Jane Dryhurst, the Mercer's great aunt. He marries an Anglesey widow, Dryhurst, in 1634 and moves to Anglesey and actually appears on the bench of justices there in 1649, right at the moment of the Commonwealth, in other words, right when you wanted to be on the right side of the Puritan authorities. So although he may have godly credential, it's surely his ties to the Middletons and his employment as a mercer which recommends him as a distributor of Bibles. In provincial towns like Denbigh, the mercers are comparatively high-status retailers, selling a range of goods not produced locally, like books. And these are key distributors of print in early modern Wales. Denbigh as a market town and regional hub is a natural site to sell on this Bible. Now, another individual more centrally connected with the book trade is Roger Royden of Bristol, a stationer who receives 50 bound Bibles from Heylyn. So at first glance, Royden might seem as a bit of an outlier amongst this group discussed hitherto, except we know that he in fact descends from the family of Roydens in Iscoed in Denbighshire. He is a distant cousin of Richard Davis of Soper Lane. Roger Royden was apprenticed to the Stationers' Company in May 1614, very unusually, in fact, to a female master, Elizabeth Bankworth, who was his aunt, his father's sister. And she was newly widowed following the death of her husband. She would go on to marry another publisher, a man called Edward Blount. Blount is the publisher of Shakespeare's First Folio in 1623. So the Royden family is intimately connected with the worlds of London printing, but also with North Wales and the Middletons. Now, our Roger Royden moves to Bristol to pursue his trade in the mid-1620s, establishing a shop on Wine Street. Bristol is a centre for the book trade in the southwest, but also in South Wales. And again, I think he has a distribution network to his hand here, as well as Welsh-speaking individuals within Bristol itself. But there's more to Royden, I think, than first meets the eye. And this emerges from yet another chancery case, which I'm not going to lay on too thickly, don't worry. But in this chancery case, we find out that Roger Royden is intimately connected with another London stationer called Michael Spark. Royden noted that for many years he had been dealing in great numbers with Michael Spark. And the lawsuit that emerges, I won't go into it in too much depth tonight for fear of getting sidetracked, but emerges from the sale of unlicensed books. And basically, Spark is trying to suggest that, Royden is trying to suggest that the seizure and disgrace had caused him to ask Spark to stop sending him any text because he had some books taken off him in Bristol, which were unlicensed. And he was like, oh, how did they get there? And he blames his London publisher, his London producer. So for his part, Spark claims that Royden is seriously indebted to him. But whatever the truth of that case, we have a connection here between two quite interesting figures, because Spark isn't just any London stationer. He is a radical Puritan bookseller. He's particularly associated with the notorious Puritan William Prynne, the man who loses his ears, and he actually stands next to Prynne doing penance at Cheapside in 1634 for publishing a controversial text called Histriomastics. You can see here it printed by Michael Spark there. Spark had published Prynne's works since 1626, and Prynne's signature is appended to his answer to Roger Royden's bill in 1634. He is also Royden's lawyer at this time. So the fact remains that Spark's a known quantity with whom Royden is doing business for years, and that he chooses as his main London supplier not anyone, but a radical Puritan and Prynne's stablemate. I would just remind you that Prynne gets taken up in 1637 to prison, and what he does when he's in Chester is he asks for a production of the Welsh Bible of 1630. I think that's quite interesting. Moreover, this is not Michael Spark's only connection with Welsh publishing in this era. On the 10th of February 1630, Michael Spark enters the publication of Dent's Sermon of Repentance in Welsh into the Stationers' Register. This is Robert Lloyd of Chirk's translation of Arthur Dent's Sermon of Repentance, which appears as Pregeth Ddiwiol and Treithia am Iawn Byll. Now, this little-known text's title page indicates that it was, as you can see there in the Welsh, produced at the desire of a group of pious men who wish for the growth of true religion and progress in the faith. Now, this sounds an awful lot like the sponsorship group behind the Middleton Halen Bible. Moreover, Spark is actually accused in April 1631 of imprinting books registered for the benefit of others and in illegally imprinting them at Oxford. And one of these texts is Dent's Sermon in Welsh. And in his answer to those claims, Sparks maintains that he was at the charge of translating Dent's sermons out of English into Welsh. And the same book was lawfully licensed and, in fact, is entered into the Hall book. This is a striking claim, I think. One of the most controversial Puritan publishers paid for Lloyd's translation of Lloyd's translation of Dent's sermon into Welsh. And in fact, he appears to have been part of a larger vernacular publishing initiative that operates between 1629 and 1632. I'll mention that in a moment. So if, as seems to be the case, Spark has connection with the circle behind the 1630 Bible, we might speculate whether it was through him that the 50 copies of the 1630 Bible ended up in Roydon's hands in Bristol. It appears once more then that the distribution circuitry of the 1630 Bible is plugged into Puritan, indeed into Presbyterian networks radiating out from the metropolis. This impression is further conveyed in the person of our fourth and final distributor of the Welsh Bibles, Oliver Thomas. Thomas is a Montgomeryshire cleric who holds an MA from Oxford. He may have been the other individual appointed to oversee the publication of this Bible in 1630, along with Michael Roberts. He'd been a pupil at Shrewsbury School. He'd probably developed connections with the godly community there. He marries his wife Mary at St Mary's in Shrewsbury in 1621. He's a relatively obscure figure in the 1620s, but he's established in 1628 at West Felton, near Oswestry in the Welsh Marches. Significantly, in that year, the radical Presbyterian Samuel Hildisham, son of the prominent Puritan cleric Arthur Hildisham, is instituted as West Felton's rector. And who puts him there? William Cockayne. William Cockayne, if you remember, is the master of one of the sponsors of Craddock, of the 1630 Bible. So it's likely then that a Godly London network is placing Oliver Thomas in there as Hildisham's curate. In addition to his duties in West Felton, then, Thomas seems to have been part of a sort of proto-Presbyterian Puritan shadow structure operating in the Welsh Marches in the 1620s and 30s, where he acts as an itinerant lecturer. As a curate in West Felton, he's also well placed to provide Bibles to Welsh-speaking communities in Montgomeryshire and also in nearby Oswestry, a deeply Welsh borough, let's remember. He's perhaps even more intriguing because he himself turns to vernacular print in 1631 to enjoin the 1630 Bible's wider use in his work, Cardiff, the Welshman's Friend. He dedicates this work to all the worthy and true-hearted well-wishers and furtherers of the spiritual weal of Wales who have put their helping hands and hearts to that late, necessary, and worthy work of setting forth the Bible in Welsh in a small volume. As we now know, then, this is the investment group, which includes Middleton, Halen, two Richard Davises, Matthew Craddock. Thomas described himself as known unto you all by name, cementing our understanding of this syndicate as fortified by personal connections and shared ideological convictions. It indicates that these personal and confessional elements may also characterize the group to which the Bibles were given and sent for wider distribution. So he's particularly intriguing, I think, as a component in this dissemination of the Bibles outlined by Alice Halen, because his Cardiff o Cymru contains a plea to the biblical sponsors to help produce other godly texts. And this draws our attention to the fact that around the time the Bible appears, there is a very unusual burst of Welsh publication between 1629 and 32. This includes Spark's edition of Dent's sermons, And there's the suggestion that Heylyn and Middleton and the interest might have had a publication interest in these texts. It seems perhaps that the Bible was only a part, albeit a very important one, of a wider vernacular publishing initiative. I'm not going to go too much into the details of this. I don't want to overstay my welcome here. But we can see, for example, Roland Vaughan's translation of the practice of piety on the left there, ymarfer o ddiwioldeb. We might notice, in fact, that Oliver Thomas's Carwr is put into the Stationers' Company by the author of that work, Lewis Bailey. We notice as well that one of the individuals who comments on the time about Heylyn's piety mentions that he was also involved in Dr. John Davis's publication, the Dictionarium Duplex, a mammoth work of scholarship appearing in 1632, which is a dictionary between Welsh and Latin. We can also place another text in this publishing orbit, Robert Lloyd translation of Arthur Dent's Plain Man's Pathway to Heaven, which is written in the autumn of 1629, appears in 1630, as you can see on the right here, as Llwybr Hyffordd. Robert Lloyd, he's a vicar of Chirk, he's known to Middleton, he's intimate with the publisher of this, Roland Vaughan, and indeed we know that he says in Vaughan says in his preface to ymarfer that similar books are coming out, including an excellent text, Llwybr Hyffordd, translated by the learned cleric, my dear teacher, Robert Lloyd. We also can see Lloyd producing a commendatory letter in the end pages of Oliver Thomas's plea for people to use the Welsh Bible, Carwr y Cymru. And I would suggest that the 1630 Bible hovers like a shadow behind all of these works. It's a necessary resource for you making sense of any of this material, I would suggest. For any indication to follow the word of God, to have any substance and meaning, you need a Welsh Bible. Now, Oliver Thomas's request in his Carwr y Cymru that they support a godly ministry in Wales is not going to come to fruition. This is because the key architects of that volume die within months of one another. Middleton in August 1631, Heylyn in February 1632. Indeed, I think it's something of an argument for suggesting that they helped support that vernacular publishing spirit because it finishes after the death of those two men. Also, the fee fees for impropriation is taken down by Charles I's government as well. And we know that this deals a serious blow to the godly cause in Shropshire and in Wales more generally. And I think it's probably a suggestion that the emergence of a man called Sir Robert Harley at Brampton Bryan in Herefordshire might well be because this initiative collapses at this time and Welsh Puritans look to Harley as their next sponsor. Indeed, it is to Robert Harley that Oliver Thomas writes from West Felton in July 1640 for his assistance in supporting Welsh ministers. In that same letter, Oliver Thomas says to Harley that Mr. Richard Davis, a merchant in Aldermanbury, will convey my mind unto you. In other words, one of the sponsors of the 1630 Bible is still connected up with Harley and Oliver Thomas. If the deaths of Middleton and of Heylyn have repercussions for Puritan sponsorship in Wales and the Marches, they also, of course, cause profound problems for the circulation of the 1630 Bible because we have these chancery suits. As Alice Heylyn reveals in May 1634, only about half of those 3,000 Bibles have actually been distributed. She's still got 1,200 on her hands, probably in her house in St Albans Wood Street in London. And these texts, of course, become caught up as estate chattels in this legal case, so she cannot sell them. So although contemporary commentators suggest that it is from, and it's interestingly, commentators usually from well after this time, that suggest that it's at the 1630 Bible point that we have a knowledge of God increasing markedly amongst the countrymen. In fact, it's not at this point that we see that so much. Let me illustrate from the fact that in the later 1630s, Oliver Thomas himself is complaining that he doesn't have a Welsh Bible. I do not have a Welsh Bible at present. May I be so bold, he asks Harley, to entreat your men to furnish me with some at the lowest price they can. That he himself possesses no text argues for serious problems, I think, with the supply chain of the volume. Writing in 1646, the radical independent Vavasor Powell produces a catechism in English, and says that he wants it translated into Welsh for my dear soul-hungering countrymen, because he says not one Welsh Bible in 500 are in that country. An exaggeration, but nonetheless a clear sort of problem. He says they groan for Bibles and teachers. Clearly, the 1630 Bible hadn't slaked demand and thirst for this. So what's the upshot of all this? What is the outcome of the lawsuit? Well, an order is made in Chancery that Dayman hands over 800 Bibles to Middleton. She never does. Alice appoints her nephew, a man called Ralph Bovey of Gray's Inn, to be her executor when she falls sick. In 1646, we have yet another Chancery lawsuit in an attempt to gain something out of the estate on the part of Anne Middleton. And Bovey in this 1646 lawsuit acknowledges that she hasn't complied with the earlier directive, that he's still got 1,200 Bibles on his hands, which he's tendered to the complainant since the decease of Alice Haleon, but she has refused to accept them, unsurprisingly. And it's at that point that these Bibles fall from her sight. And Middleton dies in 1647, and we know that Ralph Bovey, although he got a very substantial collection, a big library at his death, he doesn't have 1,200 Welsh Bibles knocking about. It seems likely that this represents a bulky and a burdensome inventory for him, and it's likely that their fate lies on the rubbish heap or in the flames at that point. But by the time that Dayman enters her second bill in Chancery, 1646, these Bibles are living in a very different world from that into which they'd been conceived. The civil wars had liberated that Puritan dynamic operated clandestinely in the 1620s. The network of Puritan sympathizers in Wales and the Marches, revealed by the Bible's distribution network, provide an important foundation for parliamentarianism in this area. So what we have here then is, I think, something that helps what other scholars have talked about, the enduring nature of clandestine underground Presbyterians emerging in the 1640s to support a rather more above ground Puritan impulse. For example, Sir Thomas Middleton's heir goes on to become a leading moderate Presbyterian and a fighter for the Parliament there. Matthew Craddock would have taken up the parliamentarian cause, no doubt, but he dies in May 1641. Alice Haleon, when we look at her will, it's a telling snapshot of godly individuals. Ezekiel Charke, who is going to be ordained by the fourth classists as a Presbyterian, a Shropshire cleric who is a Presbyterian in Hertford, Edmund Calamy, then minister at Aldermanbury, the church where Richard Davis, one of the Bible sponsors, is now worshipping. They're also generous to their relatives in Shrewsbury, the Hunts and the Nichols family. And the Hunts and the Nichols family are going to provide the core of the parliamentarian cause in Shropshire. Oliver Thomas will become a minister in the second classis in 1647. He's probably been a parliamentarian chaplain. So this is the legacy of that sort of proto-Presbyterianism, which has roots in the Jacobean period. But we found this religious politics firing a new generation, bursting beyond the bounds of what you might describe as Orthodox Puritanism in Wales in the form of people like Morgan Lloyd and Vavasor Powell. So then, we've got some important detail and dynamics here about a hitherto rather dimly understood Welsh Puritan network operating in the 1620s and 1630s. It seems that the publication of the Welsh Bible in 1630 wasn't quite so ecumenical as many historians have believed, that it was advanced, in fact, by a much more radical set of individuals. We've got connections to some quite radical sort of groups like the Fifis or Impropriations, Presbyterian sympathizers, William Prynne, Michael Spark. But similarly, we perhaps understand a little bit more now about the Welsh publishing boom of 29 to 30. that is often seen as uncontroversial, but clearly these individuals have connections with some more radical individuals. We should also recall, I think, that those distributing the 1630 Bible included a stationer with ties to radical publishing circles. So Denby Alderman was going to sit on the Anglesey bench under the Commonwealth. So the 1630 Bible then is endorsed by the clerical establishment. It's produced by the king's printers. But its foundations lie in what is clearly a godly enterprise. Its ambitions are to reform the face of provincial religion. Although its publishing troubles mean that its impact is probably less than the sponsors had hoped, the legacy of the Puritan networks which published and which disseminated it, I think, do indeed go on to transform the religious culture of Wales and the Marches from the mid-17th century onwards. And that's all I have to say about that. But if you have any questions, I'll be very happy to take them. Thank you so much for your attention.